Greetings. Welcome to our show, Ghosts R N.E.A.R, where we discuss and actively explore paranormal phenomena. I am your host, Keith Johnson, the co-founder of New England Anomalies Research, and my co-host, Sandra Johnson. Well, she's again in the studio, plugging away there. So, hello, Sandra. And our faithful crew is seeing us through. And I'd like to send out a couple of birthday shouts, if I may. Shout! But anyway, I'd like to say happy birthday to Jason Mayo. Of course, he has been a guest on Ghost R N.E.A.R frequently. And also our good friend Jay Brunel, talented musician and employee at Slater Mill, who's been a guest here as well. So happy birthday to you both. And also I'd like to say hello to a very, very dear friend. His name is Al Brown, and we affectionately know him as Brownie, Quahogger for many years until he recently retired. But he is a very, very dear friend of the family and such a wonderful, wonderful person. And he's always been so kind to our son, Keith Jr., and such a wonderful family member. So we love you, Brownie, and thank you for watching, and we never forget about you. So, our show tonight, we have an historian with us this evening, Allison Horrocks, who knows a lot about spiritualism, the Spiritualist Movement in New England and around the country, but specifically in New England, and a lot of the history and folklore in New England as well. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, you have worked at Slater Mill yourself.
That's true, absolutely.
What do you think of the old mill?
Well, it's important.
Yes, it is important.
First of its kind, so
yes.
Definitely a critical place to visit if you're interested in industry and why Rhode Island is important for the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly, exactly. And of course, that figures very prominently, obviously, into the Industrial Revolution, the first modern cotton spinning mill in the country.
Right.
And so anybody across the country or across the world, you should know and look up Slater Mill if you want more details on that. But you love working at Slater Mill and the history of it, working with school children too and everything, and adults of all ages. But you were never frightened there, I assume.
No, so I was only there during the daytime, so
Yeah.
I can say that I was never afraid to be there, but maybe you'll change my mind.
Yeah. Well, there have been times when, of course, somebody has to close the place, and I've
That's
been
right.
there well after midnight, and you hear all the things you don't usually hear, all the pings, and that's the radiator, and footsteps, that's not so easily explained, but when people start knocking at the door, then you jump up, you don't know who it is, but... And of course, my brother Carl instituted the paranormal program there at Slater Mill, and he does conducts the Mills and Mysteries, and I assist him. And they did one the other night, just Friday the 13th, of course. And he actually did experience some things there. They were in the Sylvanus Brown house, one of the buildings on the site, and he heard footsteps walking around upstairs when nobody's there. Obviously, nobody's allowed up there, so... That's some of the things that happen. But paranormal activity happens in the daytime, too, and Slater Mill is no exception.
True.
So what can you tell us about the Spiritualist Movement in New England, Allison, which I'm only vaguely familiar with?
So most people talk about early spiritualism and they talk about the state of New York, which is outside of New England, but the earliest people who are credited with starting spiritualism are Maggie and Kate Fox, who grew up in Hydesville, New York.
Familiar name?
Well, I'm sure you've heard all about, and these were two young women who were sisters who claimed that they started to hear rapping at night, and they started to hear these knocks, and that this was spirit communication. And they're really credited with starting spiritualism and getting it going. But as people start to talk about communing with the dead and finding ways to communicate, it's really places like Boston and Worcester and Providence and also Hartford that become really important. These are kind of the big hubs of newspapers and places where people share information about spiritualism.
Mm-hmm. And the Fox sisters, they became very famous, didn't they?
Yes. So they were probably the first people to be professional mediums. They were able to make a living and a career out of it, and they were later considered to be frauds, but the sisters were divided on this. One sister would always claim that even after they were supposedly exposed, that she really believed that they were able to communicate with the dead, and one sister went to her death saying that they had made everything up. So they kind of became divided themselves as to whether they were tricking people all the time.
Yeah, so how would we know the true story of that, you know?
Yeah, so there were things that people tried to set up to try to prove whether they were fakes or not, and that was really common. Starting really in the 1890s, you had people setting up entire organizations basically to test mediums to see if they were true or to see if they were just doing tricks and trying to fake people out, that they weren't really communicating.
And of course, once people realized there was a good living to be made at it, and it just kind of took off like that.
Absolutely. And some people were able to, pull off tricks for a short period of time. Some people did make careers out of it, and Harry Houdini famously spent a lot of time debunking mediums. But there were also people who said that, Houdini just also refused to believe his own eyes sometimes. So without being there, you don't necessarily know.
Right. I think in a way, Mr. Houdini wanted it to be, he wanted that ultimate proof.
Yes.
But it had to be that ultimate proof. It had to be something that was real, very, very convincing, and he knew all the tricks himself.
Exactly,
And
yes.
he could put on, he didn't deceive people, he could put on a good show of mediumship, but he'd say this is all, this is all a magic act, of course, this is all trickery, and he was one of the best at it, so he could debunk the best.
So Houdini, what really kind of tipped him over the edge was he had good friends who knew people who were mediums, and one of them said that she had received communications with his mother. And Harry Houdini was famously close to his own mother, but she didn't speak English. And when the communications came through, they were supposedly in English. And this, to Harry, indicated that the medium was lying. And there's something interesting about this, which is I've come across several sources where mediums and people in spiritualism try to come up with a completely new universal language so that people anywhere in the world will know it, and then after their death, everyone can communicate. And they obviously don't end up coming up with this, but that would have been a solution maybe to that kind of problem.
Right. And of course, he did... he was good friends, Houdini was good friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course. The Lost World and the Sherlock Holmes stories. And Lady Doyle was she was a medium, and she used to sketch, right? She used to write things in sketch, and she would not look at the paper while she was doing it. She would just... And of course, they were dear friends, and much has been made of their falling out and their disagreement, which they didn't really have that much of a falling out. It's just that Houdini eventually was not convinced again because his mother spoke Yiddish and was certainly not proficient in English, and called him Harry. And his name was not Harry, and his mother never called him Harry. He was Eric Weiss, and his Jewish name, of course, and so he was not really convinced of that. But he did go on pretty much of a tirade over the years debunking mediums, and there was one medium he really went afoul with, a famous medium who they got into like almost threatening each other and everything, and she's going to expose him and he's going to expose her and things like that, and never really did any good, but these things do happen.
Yes.
So in Providence, wasn't there something in Providence? There was a movement, a spiritualist movement in Providence, Rhode Island?
Yes. So one of the ways that you can learn about where there were mediums or where these kinds of meetings of people who believed in spiritualism took place is by looking at newspapers. And so you can look at where, with a national newspaper, which cities took out ads, and you can also just look at where these newspapers got sent to. And in Providence, there was enough people that the National Convention of Spiritualists took place there in 1866. And this would have been a really big meeting. We know there was about 3,000 people there. About half of them identified as spiritualists openly. And that was right after the end of the Civil War. And a lot of people were looking to connect with the dead after the war because so many people had lost loved ones. They really wanted to make that connection. And it's a great sort of Rhode Islandism that they actually took time out of this several-day meeting. They went to Rocky Point and had a clam bake. So they wanted to make sure that people enjoyed themselves as well. So that got written up in the newspapers too.
So what did they do? Did they just have the clam bake at Rocky Point, or did they have any spiritualist meeting? Or?
So they had a picnic, and according to the Providence Journal, there was about 3,000 people, and they were very excited to go down basically the coast to that area. They ate a lot, and there was a lot of comments that, for people who believed in the afterlife, they liked the good things in this life too. So just sort of enjoyed a day outside in the summer.
Of course, I mentioned his birthday today. Jason Mayo has been a guest on the show, and we've had some interesting discussions and episodes of Ghosts R N.E.A.R on the alleged haunting of Rocky Point and paranormal activity that's going on. And he's done a whole illustration books about Rocky, and the film too, which premiered a couple of years ago. About haunted Rocky Point and people who have had experience there. Now you're familiar with Warwick.
Yes.
Did you go to Rocky Point?
I did not. So
no, you missed out.
I did miss out. So
you must be this tall.
I have been to Rocky Point now that it's a walking track.
Oh yes.
But I never went to it as a theme park.
Yeah.
So I missed that one.
Well, it's a beautiful walking path now.
Yes,
they have
absolutely.
These kiosks where all the rides were, and they explain it and everything.
Yes, but I missed that one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It was kind of very unique, but the shore dinner hall and the clam bake, so I'm getting hungry now.
Yeah.
Going back to my childhood.
That's right.
But, okay, now we mentioned the Civil War, spiritualism and the Civil War. What about the White House?
Yes. So the Fox sisters get their start in 1848, and then by the 1860s, there's a real movement, sort of unorganized. Spiritualists famously don't want to form really big churches or have, sort of missionary work, but there's this growing sense of this going all over different states, including out west and throughout the country. And by the 1860s, of course, Abraham Lincoln is president, and Abraham Lincoln suffers both personal loss, and there's the loss of so many soldiers and lives with the Civil War. And so there are actually several seances held at the White House. And part of that is Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln's attempts to connect with their children. And one kind of interesting New England connection is there was a small group of spiritualist mediums and people who were interested in spiritualism just outside of Milford in a place called Hopedale.
Oh, Hopedale. Yes.
And that had been founded as a commune, and they ran a newspaper there about spiritualism. And they were very critical of these seances because they thought Mary Todd had paid too much. So, less than 20 years after the Fox sisters, this became something you could make a good living on.
Yes.
And they criticized that they had sort of fancy mediums.
So it became too commercialized, right?
So according to these folks, they didn't think that you should be a medium to make money or to exploit people's pain, but you should do it to fight for social causes. And a lot of people who were involved in spiritualism were also involved in the abolition of slavery and votes for women. And for African Americans in general. So
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so there was a famous quote at that time that, of all the ballots cast for abolition, tenfold there would be of all the spiritualists. So spiritualists were very involved in those social movements, which is interesting because you think these are people who believe in life after death, but they don't think you should wait for death to be happy. And a justification for slavery was that people would be free when they died.
Right.
Which now seems like a terrible way to think about it, but spiritualists rejected that completely. And they thought, people come back in all sorts of forms, and you have to respect people alive and dead.
Right, and basic human rights and tolerance.
Absolutely.
And of course, Hopedale is a mill town itself.
It is, yes. It was a company town even then. So, yeah, so it was founded in 1840s, 1842, and it was a place where women could fully participate in politics. And most places where women had a strong political voice, there was almost always spiritualism.
Really?
So if you were a woman in the 1830s or 1840s and you wanted to speak out about an issue, it was considered really inappropriate for you to go out in public and to talk.
Sure.
But if you were doing a public seance, people considered that a little bit different. That was kind of like a pass.
Right.
And not everyone liked it, but a lot of
considered it entertainment.
Exactly, like acting. And a lot of women actually used seances, they claimed, to channel people like George Washington. And Isabella Beecher Hooker in Hartford was famous for this. She would claim to channel famous early American leaders and say that they told her that women should be able to vote.
Oh, really?
So she became kind of famous for this, oh, George Washington told me.
Yeah.
And so for some people that could have gone, to almost tongue-in-cheek. But there were a lot of people who thought they were connecting with great leaders of the past, and women who just used this as a chance to have a public voice. So women who wanted to vote, again, were really heavily involved in this, and vice versa.
Oh, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, unexpected, right?
Right, women's suffrage and everything plays into that.
The first woman to run for president was actually a spiritualist leader.
Really?
Yep, so Victoria Woodhull ran for president in 1872. She couldn't vote.
Right, she couldn't vote, but she ran for...
That didn't stop her, and she was actually the first woman to run. She didn't have party support, obviously, but she made a lot of money because she consulted people on Wall Street, and basically she claimed red futures for them.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So she made other people a lot of money, and they paid her a lot of money. And she was in with all the big suffragettes of the day, and she ran for president.
Wow.
She didn't make it.
No, but how far did she get, though?
Not very.
No.
No, and her life was tough because she was involved in a lot of radical movements, and a lot of people who were involved in spiritualism in those early years were pushing really hard for abolition, so to end slavery. And when African American men got the vote before all women, that really fractured a lot of folks. There was a big divide. Women who were frustrated that they didn't get the vote. So there was kind of a breakdown in some groups. And Victoria Woodhull was someone who had sort of drama with other activists of her day.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I wasn't really very familiar with her.
Yeah, she's really fascinating.
Yeah. So back to the Civil War again. Have you ever been to Gettysburg?
I have, yes.
Ever experienced anything there? Or did you just do research?
I didn't, no. So I was just there as a visitor.
Right.
And so I've never had a kind of direct experience there. For me, it's more about, it's haunted in a different way. Does that make sense? Like, I think places can feel haunted even if you don't see something.
Yeah, there's a certain aura, energy about the place, and you can pick up on that. Sure.
Just knowing what's happened, I think, can make a place give you a feeling. And that, to me, is, just as valid as someone seeing something or hearing something. I sort of joke with people that, being a historian, most of the people I write and think about are dead.
Yeah.
And so for me, really thinking hard about how other people lived is like spiritualism. Because you're trying to connect yourself to people who aren't alive.
Right.
So I don't, host seances, I do research, but I think there's a connection there where you're trying to make people who aren't alive anymore real to people today.
Yes.
Which you do too.
Exactly. And there is that famous photo of Mary Todd Lincoln with her husband supposedly in back of her.
Yes, which I think is super fake, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's been proven, yeah.
pretty much been
Just
debunked because
too bad.
Yeah, the photographer put an actor there. He took the photo of Mary and said, "Okay, I have to develop this plate, and I will notify you when it's ready." Meanwhile, he calls an actor in, takes the picture and exposes it again, just halfway. So he's just like but it does look like Abraham Lincoln, but looks like a reenactor as Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. But I mean, photography was a big deal, partially because it gave you something of a person, that felt so real even after they were dead.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that spiritualism is big as the same time as photography.
Oh yeah, photography did play a big part in that. Still
and the
does.
telegraph.
Yes, the telegraph. Yes.
There were all these new ways to communicate with people, and so the invention of Braille, of sign language, all these new ways, people who many thought you could never communicate with them. It wasn't that big of a stretch to think, we could communicate with everyone who's ever lived at some point.
Right.
Which is an interesting way to put it.
We worked on a case, it wasn't a spiritualist case, but we worked on a case in East Providence where it was communication through tapping. And the family, the husband's brother had passed away, and he was very gregarious, very outgoing, loved his pasta and everything. So they were getting communication through him, so they called us in. And you really could hear that. They asked the question, and he'd answer, he didn't do like one or two taps, but it was always one tap. And all the family members at different points were present with us and made sure nobody was in the basement. Now that did seem genuine.
Yeah.
That did seem genuine because my brother and another investigator went outside, and they actually felt those taps and heard it in the sidewalk. So nobody's
doing it, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And it revolved around their teenage daughter who was having problems in school. But part of the problem she was having was people were hearing those taps around her too when she was at school. And we were doing a whole communication session, listening and everything. But then, of course, I chime in and I ask, gee, Uncle Frankie. No, I didn't ask him. I asked one of the family who was communicating, ask if he ever sees angels where he is. And he asked, Frank, did you ever see angels? Nothing. Suddenly it stopped. I put a little religious bent into that. Suddenly it stops. There's no communication. Frank, you there? You won't answer that.
That's weird.
Yeah. Oh, you just want to see the pretty girls, don't you? And then tap again.
That's funny.
But I found it interesting that what kind of spirit is this? That you mention anything that has to do with holiness or God, and it, I've seen that before, where it just stops.
Yeah.
Stops dead. Forgive the pun, but
right.
So, you familiar with Katie King?
No.
Oh, Katie King. She was interesting. That's Katie King would appear, and she would like semi-darkened room. She'd come out. She'd be wearing.
Oh, like the gauze.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes she'd even go around.
She got in trouble.
Yes.
Too much touching, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Touching and a little kissing here and there.
Yes.
She did get in trouble. Yeah. Looked a little too much like the husband's wife there.
Oh, yeah, that's a problem.
And she would always. They had a magic spiritualist door where Katie King. People really were convinced though, but the wife would always go out. A few minutes later, then comes Katie King, looking, except for the doors, looking a little too much like mistress of the household, but but it did make a lot of money. A lot of money, and it was very, very famous at the time.
So someone kind of like that, who's very interesting, that the Society for Psychical Research, which was the big group based out of London, and it still exists, but really was at kind of the height of its popularity. They were doing a lot of debunking. They were really putting a lot of mediums out of business. That was kind of what they were doing. And in the 1890s, they visited this woman named Eusebia Palladino, who lived in Naples, Italy. And she did a lot of similar physical things. She was a physical medium, but everything she did had to do with her body and others' bodies. Mm-hmm. She would fluctuate 17 pounds, so she would gain weight, lose weight.
Really, yeah.
There would be ectoplasm, which if you're interested in spiritualism is kind of this unique thing that exists, but basically things coming from your body that are supposed to be like spirit masses. Mm-hmm. And the SVR spent so much time with her, but they were always really puzzled by how she was doing it. And she's one of a small number of cases from that time where they would basically not willing to say that she was legitimate, but they couldn't prove she was a fraud.
Yeah, right.
And so a few people ended up in that category where they just weren't sure, but they were trying to be proper Englishmen. Mm-hmm. And so similar to what you're describing, they were afraid to put too many restraints or to touch her arms.
Right.
So she could have also been playing them like a fiddle.
Yes, yeah, possible.
Or been legitimate. We don't know now. So.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's interesting. Now, how about Mercy Brown? You're very familiar with the Mercy Brown story and the Nellie Bourne story.
I know about Mercy, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Really tragic.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think about is just how awful that must have been to be surrounded by that much death.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Mercy Brown, her own father, had to dig her up because there was this belief that she was a vampire and that they had to take out her heart so she wouldn't affect anyone else.
Right.
But it was winter in Rhode Island.
Yes.
So it's rocky and it's rough. That must have been awful for that family.
Yes. Yeah. One death after another. And of course, tuberculosis, which they called consumption, was rampant and everything like that. But
So I didn't see Mercy, but I will tell you very briefly. I used to go trick-or-treating in the neighborhood where she is buried. And I will tell you, my friend and I would get ourselves so psyched up, by the end of the night, we'd be running back. Because so many people would talk about Mercy. And again, I think places can be haunted in lots of ways.
Yes.
And if you get in your head that there is a bad energy there is, because you've manifested it for yourself.
I think people bring negativity into these places. I mean, it's hallowed ground, but people, do vandalism and
absolutely,
all sorts of, things that they shouldn't be doing. But I know my friend Charles has had some experiences in West Greenwich and Nellie Bourne, of course, but she was basically mistaken for Mercy Brown.
Oh.
And that's how that started.
Oh, no.
Yeah, supposedly in 1967, a high school class went looking for Mercy Brown. They went to the wrong town. And they got the spooky cemetery, and the headstone said, "I'm waiting and watching for you. There's our girl," so that started it.
Yeah, of course.
Well, believe it or not, we're almost out of time because this has been so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's really, you know so much history about this.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, it's been great. Been great to have you. Will you come back again and tell us some real juicy stories?
I'd love to, yeah.
Very quickly, what do you think of time displacements?
Like wrinkles in time?
Yeah.
I think time is probably too complicated for us to understand.
That's a good point.
And it's sort of become a cliche, but I think time is a flat circle.
Yeah.
So I think time is constantly evolving, and our brain can only